Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this series of lectures. My name's Jamie Davis, and it's been my great privilege to put together the lecture programme, and I've been immensely lucky that we have some stellar speakers who have agreed to speak on various different aspects of this term's theme, which is of crossing boundaries. I know some of you in the audience are going to be following this as an undergraduate course. Others are students here because you're interested, and then there are many other people from other walks of life who maybe were once students or maybe have never been, but for this next hour, you will be, enjoying what I'm sure is going to be a tremendous lecture. The format of these lectures is that we tend not to interrupt lectures when they're going on, but there will be plenty of opportunity for asking questions at the end. And our helpers will come around with microphones, so at the end I'll indicate when this should happen, but there'll be plenty of time to ask questions. So please remember them, but hold on to them until then. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce for this first lecture Professor Jolyon Mitchell from this university. He's the Professor of Communications, Arts and Religion, and he's the Director of our Centre for Theology. He was educated at Cambridge and at Durham for his first and second degrees, and then did a PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And then he worked outside of academia for a while, working for the BBC, being a producer and a journalist for the sort of BBC flagships of Radio 4 and the World Service. And I'm sure some of his academic interests arose from what he experienced there. He then came to Edinburgh, became a professor, directed the Centre for Theology and Public Issues, and is currently president of the National Centre of Theology and Religious Studies. He has many honours, including fellowships at things like the Royal Society of Arts, but I want to keep this introduction relatively short so you can hear the man you came to hear. The one last thing I want to say, though, is that when I contacted Jolyon to ask him if he'd be willing to give this lecture, he apologised for giving a slight delay to the reply because he was rather out of contact in the West Bank. So he doesn't think and write about everything he does just from an ivory tower of a university. He really knows of what he speaks. Thank you very much for doing this.
Good evening. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Can I please invite you on a walk? And it's a walk around the Old City in Jerusalem. But before we start this walk, I'd be really helped to know if you've been to the Old City in Jerusalem. Could you put your hand up, please, if you've been there? Could you keep your hand up if you've been there more than 10 times? One or two. Great. Well, anyone who's been there, in fact, anybody, feel free to correct me on this walk as we travel around the Old City of Jerusalem. This is a shot that was taken a few weeks ago, and I decided not to play the clip. We took about 7 goes to get this take. It's just a very short introduction to the project I was working on, or have been working on, which is trying to bring together Jewish, Christian, Muslim religious leaders along with Palestinian and Israeli journalists. And as we were taking that shot, where often ABC and BBC and CBC stand, the shot there, it's a sort of Palestinian TV station, there was drilling going on the roof next door, and the cameraman found it was hysterical. He found it was very funny that I kept having to stop sort of telling the story. But what I want to invite you to do is to go beyond the boundaries of the walls here and into the Old City. But I'd like to invite you to start. We're going to start the walk here up at Damascus Gate, the Damascus Gate. I've got a few photographs of that. And you can maybe just make it out here, built in the 1520s by Suleiman the Magnificent. Well, probably not built by Suleiman himself, but you can also maybe make out here, that's actually Roman remains of a Roman gate because it goes back to the time of Hadrian as well. You can see here this has a long history. We could do a whole lecture around probably the Damascus Gate, but I'm not going to. This is completely gratuitous, but I did a bit of research on camels, which has got nothing to do with this lecture, but did you know that camels have something like over 1,000 different names for them in Arabic? And in other languages as well. Now, What's funny, you'll probably remember that more than anything else in the whole lecture, perhaps. But anyway, we're going to move on from the Damascus Gate. It's also known as the Gate of the Column. This is from the 1920s, during the 1930s, from the British Mandate period, soldiers guarding it. This is British soldiers actually searching for weapons in September 1938 as well. This is more recently taken during this project that I've been involved in. Now, I'm going to play in a moment a clip from ITV News, which we had a long discussion about, very helpful discussion about how much of it to play, because it does involve quite a bit of violence, and actually there's someone shot in it. We decided to edit that out. You can see it online, but I just didn't want to give you all of it because I wanted to give you the choice of whether you watched it or not. Nevertheless, I think it's a useful starting point because it gives you an insight of something that happened at the Damascus Gate very recently, and is also symbolic of a number of other things that have happened there. So this is ITV News back from October 2015.
A man died at Jerusalem's Damascus Gate today, and at the spot where he drew his last breath, prayers are said.
Allahu Akbar wa lillahi alhamd. Allahu Akbar wa lillahi alhamd.
There is no doubt, because he tried to attack with a knife the police officers.
Can you describe the officer's reaction to that?
The officers reacted as they, we teach them, how we train them.
The police say this man posed a lethal threat. He was dealt with lethal force.
But among Palestinian eyewitnesses, there's anger at what they see as completely unjustified police action.
They not shoot to stop him. They shoot to kill. About 10 soldiers start shooting from M16 rifles. Shoot about him maybe 100 bullets.
And what do you think about that? What do you
I think this is racism. This is country of racism. Israel is racism, terrorist country.
Political leaderships on both sides agree that social media is playing a big role in encouraging these attacks. But while Palestinians say the attackers are trying to defend their people's rights, the Israelis condemn what they call the online incitement of young people into holy war.
This is about hatred. This is about indoctrination. This boy, like many others, was indoctrinated to hate the Jews, to kill the Jews, to get rid of the Jews.
The Israeli authorities have placed new police checkpoints around this city in an attempt to increase security and stop the attacks. But in a place where anger is building every day, it hasn't worked. Geraint Vincent, News at 10, Jerusalem.
Notice how the journalist there was trying very hard to offer two sides of the story. The part we actually cut out, which is the part that I can't get out of my mind, is of a young man running down the steps towards Damascus Gate with a knife in his hand, and then he shot again and again and again. So this story has at its heart of it a very, very violent moment. But part of why I offer that is just as an example of some of the difficulties of how you cover a story, such as what happened here at the Damascus Gate. Of course, as you walk there today, as you perhaps know, you'll see many soldiers and border police on guard there. I've been walking back and through that gate over the last year regularly, and I have never felt a sense of danger, which is often friendliness and warmth from many of the Palestinians there, and as well as the Israelis. The only moment I felt slight adrenaline was when some Israeli doctors were surrounding and taking away a Palestinian who just had a cardiac arrest, who'd had a heart attack. So it's interesting how this space, you could describe it as a space of violence. In fact, often how it's experienced is as an everyday space as part of the old city of Jerusalem. And I just use these as examples. When you walk through the gate, you're confronted by a cacophony of sound and a whole sort of serendipity of smells, whether that's from the food here or from the different spices. I'm really bad at haggling and bartering in these places, but I have friends who are much better than I have. Now, this is by a friend, a filmmaker, and I just want to show you, if you don't want to come on the walk with me, there are other ways of walking around the old city. You can see, there's no sound to this, so don't worry, you're not expecting, it just gives you a sense of, this is walking down from the Damascus Gate. And again, it's a trading space. People here are here every day. It's a place of normal sort of everyday practices. of selling, of buying, that you can catch tourists, religious people from each of the Abrahamic faiths and other faiths as well as different kinds of tourists. If this journey in the next few minutes is too exhausting for you, there are opportunities for rest en route. And this is looking back just towards the Damascus Gate. You can maybe just see the view backwards. The first place I'd like to walk down, and you can maybe notice, hopefully this spot will work. Yes, it does. So we're walking down here. Notice that we're walking between the Christian quarter and Muslim quarter, and we're going to go not to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but to somewhere very close to it. That's a shot within the Holy Sepulchre. But to here, the Church of the Redeemer. This is a German Lutheran church, and there I've been meeting and interviewing a number of different religious leaders, not Pope Francis, just to hasten to add, but Bishop Munib Yonan. Just to pause for a moment, this is an extraordinary photograph, if you think about it, because it's the guy who at that stage was in charge of the Lutheran Church. He was the president of the Lutheran World Federation, meeting and praying with the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis. If you think about that in terms of 500 years ago, the history, this is a very significant moment historically. I think in Lund, if I remember correctly, in Sweden, where they met. Anyway, Bishop Munib was born in Jerusalem and tells a fascinating story. This is just a very short extract. I should say that I'm going to play you some stuff that we haven't shown before in public at all. It's very much a work in progress, but these are, if you like, the world premieres of just extracts from interviews from different religious leaders in different parts of Jerusalem. So here's Bishop Munib.
You have 1 minute, far from my home is the Holy Sepulchre and my Lutheran church. 2 minutes is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Haram al-Sharif. 3 minutes is the Wailing Wall. So if you grow in Jerusalem, you grow in a diverse society where you think why we are different and how can we live together in our difference.
Perhaps that's one question to bear in mind as we go on this walk through the Old City, which is how do we live together in our difference? You could pluralize that, of course. How do we live together in our differences? Now, one of the ways he does it is he does it through writing and speaking around the world, and he's very much an arguer for taking seriously issues of justice, but also, as you can see here, witnessing for peace, and also how you move towards reconciliation. That does not mean he ignores issues that are pertinent to him as a Palestinian. It was very interesting in this interview, he reflected on being a Palestinian who was very closely aligned with Muslim brothers and sisters, as well as with Christians as well. So those are two of his books. Another thing he pointed out was this, the Balfour Declaration. He looked at me, I remember mid-interview, and he said, you know, you British have got to apologise for this, which was quite an interesting sort of moment to sort of pause. And it was interesting reflecting on that after the interview to think about how the challenge of history, the constraints of history, shape how we walk through different spaces. This is the Balfour Declaration. I'm no expert on the Balfour, and I can see one or two people who know a lot more about it than I do in the room. But it's interesting, I found this book very useful if you're interested, which is reflecting on that. I believe that this is, if I'm correct, the only known surviving handwritten draft of the Balfour Declaration. One of the things I've learned from this book, which I found very helpful, is the way in which the British were, as you perhaps know, in a war of what was perceived as a war of national survival. And in order to do that, they made all sorts of promises. The Balfour Declaration was one amongst a number. So there was also a correspondence between what's called sometimes the Hussein Mcmahon Correspondence, where we promised various things to Arab leaders. And then also was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the secret agreement that carved up the Middle East. As I say, I'm not an expert, and there'll be an opportunity in much greater detail to explore this together in a public lecture, the annual W.M. Watt lecture, by a Palestinian historian who I think has also been at University College London, on powerful symbols in the British Zionist Alliance from Balfour to Mcmahon. Nobody asked me to advertise that, but I just wanted to say that in a way, on a walk, you can only sometimes you just walk quickly past things, don't you? And then you think, oh, hang on, that's really important. And the same way with the Balfour Declaration. I'm aware we're walking quickly, but we could return to it at another time. Of course, another way in which he copes with difference is he emphasizes interreligious dialogue and conversation. This is him meeting one of the leaders, sometimes seen as the sort of top guy in the Sunni world, Sunni sort of religious leader, the Grand Imam of Al-Khazar in Cairo. So what I'd like to do now is we are here, you remember, and we're going to walk. Let me see if you can work out where we've just walked to. There's another. We're going to walk close, very close, and we're going to talk here to a number of people who didn't want to be interviewed on film. For different reasons for that, I'll explain that perhaps a bit later. But they were very keen that I should walk around this space, around the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque as well. And one of the things I found, it was just this sense of moving from the shops to this beautiful space, calm, quiet, and this beautiful mosque at the centre, which actually I found sort of breathtaking and interesting respite from the busyness of the city. And it was interesting talking to a number of Muslim leaders who talked, for example, very explicitly and in detail and with passion, things saying such as this: we don't hate the Israelis, we hate the occupation. Or, and this was a refrain that I heard again and again, without justice there can be no peace. So it's interesting how sometimes phrases stick in your mind even when you're not recording them. There was one, now this is where, reflecting back, I'm going to cheat now because actually we're just going to pause the walk because this guy we interviewed not in Jerusalem but in Ramallah, in the often seen as the capital of the Palestinian Authority, north of Jerusalem in the West Bank. He is like he's the head of the Sharia courts, often known as Habash. Notice the quote here again: we don't see Jews as enemies, the enemy is the occupation. It's interesting in terms of the argument. Again, he didn't want to be filmed at this stage, but if you do want to see him speak, for copyright reasons I couldn't play it today, but you can find it online. Very recent sermon that he gave in June of this year, where he made a number of very striking statements about walls and spaces, but arguing that actually this is more than politics. Our position stems first and foremost from ideological and religious considerations. We cannot possibly relinquish a single millimetre, a single stone, a single micromillimetre of the Al-Barak wall and of the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque. Forgive my Arabic pronunciation, which is non-existent, so please correct me afterwards. This is often seen as the area where the Prophet, peace be upon his name, where would actually, on the night of his night journey, he would tie up his steed there at that spot. So obviously this is the Western Wall, but also this is a very significant place for Muslims as well. Often seen, this whole area here, as the third most significant Muslim site in the world. That's just a reminder of one of the reasons why this space is so significant to Muslims, because of the belief this is where that's sort of the place that the Prophet left for his night journey. Notice here, again, looking down, you can see here an interesting barrier between spaces one prays as a man or as a woman on the Western Wall. And I use that, looking there, I started to think about a person that we interviewed in Jerusalem. Again, actually not in the Old City, but he talked very interestingly about some of the Old City. This is the Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem. And again, because this is so fresh and it's actually all in Hebrew, I'm not going to play it, but I wouldn't just sort of, I can't summarize because it's an hour interview, but for me, the part that I will never forget, extraordinary moment, was the last 15 minutes of the interview, where he talked about he was been born in Morocco and where he'd enjoyed the hospitality of Muslims there, the warm hospitality. But then the rise of nationalism led that some groups started bullying him as a teenager, to the point that he got beaten up and teased and thrown in prison. And he was even said, and this is where there's a phrase that's translated for me, but he said, we were actually told, we're going to put you in the ovens too. and this was in the late 1940s, or early 1950s, I think it was late 1940s. So it's interesting, in this conversation, he didn't talk about what the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif as the site of the Second Temple or Solomon's Temple. He didn't talk about the destruction of the Second Temple. He talked rather about his own story and about the reality that actually different religious groups have different reasons for understanding this place, surrounded by walls, as so sacred and so significant. It was interesting, another interviewee responded by simply saying that actually this is the place of great sacredness, potential peace, but it's also a place that a world war could begin. Listening to him and listening to his story made me think of somewhere not in the old city, but of Yad Vashem, just in West Jerusalem. And in a way, it's hard not to think about that when you hear stories such as Chief Rabbi Amar's comments as well. But I picked this photo by Lucy Lyon, a friend who's a filmmaker, who, partly because it encapsulates, you'll see here both the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome of the Rock there, but also the Western Wall. So notice here the close physical juxtaposition. You can see this as a boundary point, but it's also a meeting point as well. The translator and my guide, in a way, through different aspects of Judaism in Israel has partly been David Rosen, the figure here. He was, this is David Rosen here, working with other religious leaders in Assisi. He's a rabbi who was a chief rabbi in Ireland and also, I think, in South Africa, but now he advises on foreign affairs to the chief rabbinate in Israel. So he lives in Jerusalem with his family. It's interesting to hear him reflect on the processes involved in religious dialogue as well. I don't know, does it help if we dim these lights a little bit for seeing the films, or is it okay? I can't see. Is it fine? Okay, that's helpful. Okay. So this is Rabbi David Rosen.
Religion should be synonymous with building peace. Every single religion aspires for that, and therefore all religions should be in the forefront of peace building in the world. The problem is that religion is wrapped up with human identity, and when human identities are under threat, they turn to the religious resources in order to give them succor and strength, and very often manipulate them in terms of even not only providing self-justification, but of delegitimizing the other. And then religion actually, if you like, turns on itself and becomes a pathology instead of the agent of healing that it should be. But because religion relates to the deepest dimensions of our spiritual, psychological identities, it is critical for any kind of process of healing between communities in conflict. And therefore, failure on the part of political or diplomatic agents to engage the religious dimension as a resource and its leadership as partners in that healing process is totally self-destructive and undermining their own interests.
It's interesting, isn't it, reflecting on what he's just said in terms of the importance of groups listening across barriers, across boundaries. I know that's a slightly, I'm being a bit unfair to what he said, because obviously it's more complex in terms of relation to identity as well. This is a quote that I've heard, that is on his website, if you want to follow it. Interreligious dialogue is an essential component in facilitating peaceful reconciliation in international relations for the well-being of our world as a whole. It's interesting, you see he's involved in that in very practical ways. This was a moment which brought together the leaders, Simon Peres and Abbas, in the Vatican Garden. That's David Rosen there praying. I'd like now to walk here with you between the Muslim quarter and Jewish quarter this way. So we're coming back from here, and then we're going to end up, we're going to meet there, which is the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. And we met this guy. When I met him, he wasn't wearing all this. This is Theophilus III. He leads the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, and let me just say it's, again, fascinating to hear his reflection. We talked for a long time, quite abstractly, about theology, but then we talked about the liturgy, which is clearly something he's passionate about. It was interesting hearing his reflections on peace and religion. This is just a short clip.
With peace, we pray to God for peace. First of all, we start asking God to give us peace in order to start our prayers. And then we pray for the peace of the whole world. This is fundamental. In peace, let us pray to the Lord. This is how our liturgy starts. Yes, and then we are asking for peace of the local area, for peace of the broader area, and for the peace for the whole world. And peace is always, time and again, repeated, and during the services and the divine liturgy, the bishop and the priest, in many interval times, comes and blesses the people, saying, "Peace be with you."
I don't know if you just heard that was somebody in the other side of the room shouting "Amen" at the end, which was a. So that's very close to the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. You can just walk down to the Latin Patriarchate, not on the same day. These interviews, that interview took 9 months to organise, and on the morning of the interview, we didn't know we were going to interview. We got a phone call saying, "Oh, we can do an interview," and they said, "When?" "Now," which was exciting. So it was very good to be able to interview. So this is the guy in charge, the Archbishop Pia Battista Pizzabella, who is a Franciscan and has recently taken over, effectively running the Catholic Church in Jerusalem.
I don't know if I should confess here in front of the camera, but for a long time in my life, I was tired of this word, justice and peace. Not because I don't want justice and peace, don't misunderstand me, I want justice and peace. I pray for this, but it became a kind of a slogan, and also I think it was hijacked by some groups in the church, in the society. I don't want to be associated with all these groups and so on. And now I pray in justice and peace. I pray first for me in my heart, to be just and peaceful to all people I meet. This is the first thing. I need to start for myself. And to ask also my communities, now I am bishop, the communities that belong to our church, to be just and peaceful in our communities. We cannot teach others justice and peace if we don't have justice and peace in our everyday life, with our relation with the workers, our relations among us, with the priests, with all the flock, all the different communities. There, first of all, to be a place where justice and peace are not just slogans that we say for others, but a life we live first in the first person. And then I pray for this. I pray the Lord to bring to know people with whom we can talk and build something just and peaceful in everyday relations. I don't go beyond this.
Do you notice here how he moved from personal to something more structural and outward looking? It's interesting in terms of his argument there. Now, you might have noticed that a number of these interviews, in fact all of the interviews so far, have been middle-aged male religious leaders. So as a counterpoint to that, I'd like to explore the reality of how sometimes barriers, boundaries impact on everyday lives. This is just it's an extract from a short film called The Gate.
بالمدرسة مرشدة مشانها جابوها عشان بك ضلت قاعدة في الصف تعيط وصافنة بطيحوا منها على 6:30 بطلعوا على 7 7:30 بطلعوا يوم تبكي يعني الجندي بكمني على البوابة يوم بكي على 9 على 10 حسب مزاجي. في الضايق يوم بدي أطلع مشوار بحب يعني بحب أجهز حالي بدي أطلع. لما أطلع برا وأشوفه هذا خلاص بتنكد. بدي أطلع بدي أقعد على البوابة الساعة وبدي أطلع بدي على الرجعة وبدي شي بدي أطلع شي بدي أعبر شي بدي بس الواحد يفكر فيها. يعني بنطي على البوابة مرة بطول يعني في نحكي معهم يشوفونا على الكاميرات دقيقتين يعني فيش دقيقتين بيفتحوا في نص ساعة في ساعة في ساعتين والفترة في الشتاء قعدنا 12 يوم. حكيت لما أعبر بسد وراي بحس حالي عبرت على وين عسجن.
المدرسة منيحة، أنا بحب أدرس فيها. أنا وحيدة. البوابة بتبعدني عن كل الأشياء اللي بحبها.
الجدار عشان يعني بلف من هنا على كل ساعة هو مكان الجدار هذا مش بس يعني على البلد هيك عشان يفصلوا البلد عن المستوطنات تبعتها. والله بيجوا هاي بروحوا بيجوا هاي وبطلعوا طرح طرنات بيجوا شمات هواء بيجوا معي شمات هواء وشي نحن نقعد نتفرج عليهم. يعني بنقول يعني هي مهم الهم حريتهم، احنا مش معطينا حريه ما نهم ماخذين حريتهم.
There's so much we could say about that film, but it is striking, isn't it, the implications of dividing walls, of boundaries when they are turned into barriers, and how it can actually damage individual lives. Now you may be thinking, wasn't that a bit of a cheat? We're meant to be walking around Jerusalem and you've just shown something out of Jerusalem. Yes, it was, but I suppose my defence is that I first saw that film in Jerusalem with a filmmaker who showed it to me, and it made me think differently about some of the gates I've been walking through so easily. Whereas actually for many people the experience is actually these walls you can't walk through. Now many people have written, explored, studied the barrier that you will know can be traced here. We could do a whole lecture on this. I think it's Mark Thomas, the comedian's done a walk all along this, the barrier here. There's a lot that could be said about this map, a huge amount, such as it looks a bit like Swiss cheese in terms of the different Palestinian areas, but also thinking about where the barrier goes. I'm very happy to talk about that later, but I don't claim expertise. I haven't walked along the area, but nevertheless it is interesting thinking about how it's used, why it's there. And I just for a moment, when I thought about that, and you can see it from some places when you go high up in the Old City in Jerusalem, you can actually just about see the barrier. I started thinking about other work I've been doing with some friends, colleagues, on barriers around the world. So now, just for a few minutes, because I'm aware it's probably quite warm at the top of the lecture theatre here, I'm going to play a few games, not all more questions really. Can I ask you, over the last 12 years, how many miles of new separation barriers have been built around the world? Any guesses? Shout them at me. Any guesses? 10,000. Did you say? Yeah, close. We'll say that's pretty close. We'll stop there, but it's actually close to 6,000. It may be 10,000, but it's at least 6,000 in 65 different countries. It's interesting to think, why have there been all these going up? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite you to see if you can, there are some clues in these pictures, but can you tell me please where these barriers are, separation barriers? Where's that? Yeah, spot on. Where's that? I thought I'd put the easy one in first because I thought it might be hard. It's actually North Korea as well, but it's often seen as a form of resistance because there's sometimes seen as prayer flags. There's a bit more on the 38th parallel. I'm drawing on this partly on research done in 2013 on The Guardian. You can follow this up online. It's fascinating, on the walled world. Where's that? Yeah, it is the US, that's right. And of course, one could talk about this, but it's interesting. The thing that I found fascinating about this is the existing fence is here. I hadn't realised there was actually quite so much already. Where's that? same sort of place. Again, it's the Mexico. I should know the precise place. I think it's on the... No, I'm not going to guess because I'm going to get that wrong. But interesting noticing that... how about there? Yeah. Well, yeah. Who said that? I can't see you. Yes, that's right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is there, isn't it? So as part of that, we could have a long talk about that. How about there? Yep, that's right. Sometimes known as the peace wall. Again, notice how sometimes there's forms of resistance going on the walls. It's interesting, isn't it? How that happens. Okay, so of course one could get rather depressed by looking at these growth of barriers and everywhere. But it's interesting to think about the end of walls, how they've been ended. One end is they become put to different uses. I know people who have parties along here, sprints along here, along the Great Wall of China, which I believe is one of the few things you can see from outer space. Is that right? I haven't seen it. It's not true. Have you been there? It's a myth. You haven't been there. Ask anyone. Okay, great. Okay, well that's very disappointing, but anyway. But it's good to have things demythologized, so thank you. I don't know your name, but it'd be great to... What is your name? George. Thanks, George. That's great. Or, of course, they become tourist, well, not just tourist spots, but they come to climb. You can probably guess I believe that's Hadrian's Wall, or was. And, of course, here, Brandenburg Gate. We had I was helped by Sarah, I had about a dozen photos of the Berlin Wall, and we selected it down to this one, which you can just see, can you imagine what's happening here? These are newly arrived children, whether they're twins, I don't know, being showed to their grandparents across the other side of the wall. And of course, walls do come to an end. But sometimes there are different ways of resisting dividing walls. For example, this, you just climb over them. Of course, that's very dangerous. But notice this, you show me a 50-foot wall, and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. Or this humour. Anyone who wants to build border walls is not a Christian. I'm going to let that cartoon speak for itself. Though I should say, actually, online I've seen a number of people pointing out that there's a lot of walls around the Vatican, but that's another thing to... so it's Of course, there's symbolic acts. You perhaps recognise this as in Auschwitz. This is Pope Francis walking towards a wall that was used for a place that many people were shot and killed, murdered. Going to light a candle, and that is Pope Francis again at the Western Wall. But Pope Francis understands the skill of symbolic action. You'll perhaps remember he stopped for an unexpected stop when he was visiting Bethlehem here at the barrier and prayed there at the barrier wall. Now you may be thinking another way, one of the things I'm really interested in is how the arts can be used to break down walls. And this is the picture here is actually of the Tree of Life, which I've talked about in other contexts, happy to talk about thinking about it, how it might be used to symbolize the breakdown of the end of the civil war in Mozambique. But the reason I reference that is simply this, which takes us back to Jerusalem, to the old city, the Tree of Hope. This is by a British sculptor called Mark Careth, and you maybe can just work out here that this is actually based on an olive tree, but instead of leaves or metallic leaves like the Tree of Life, he's actually turned them into swifts. And these symbols you can see on hospitals in Gaza as well. It's very powerful, actually. There's a film, if you're interested, by Lucy Lyon again, called The Tree of Hope. But it's interesting, I was hearing an Israeli, is the right word, an ornithologist, who did an amazing talk on birds in the Holy Land and how brilliant birds were at actually going across barriers. And he was tracking them and how they move very easily from the West Bank to places in Israel and so on. Of course, other forms of resistance, other kinds of art, these are famous pictures by Banksy, taking us into another world. Of course, there's criticism of these pictures because some people say, well, it doesn't really do justice to the actual difficulties, the hardship of the life by the walls, because of the walls. Again, this is a short film, very new film, which is interesting to think further in a bit more detail about an artist who's driven by a particular religious insight, to think about how you resist walls.
A wall represents a failure of politics. You can't love your neighbour if you can't see them, if you can't talk to them. A Lady Who Brings Down Walls is probably my most famous work. By putting an icon, something of incredible beauty, onto something which is itself so ugly, it's a way to challenge it and to break it. It's invoking the powers of heaven, the powers of reconciliation, the powers of love, into a chasm of despair and hopelessness. A lot of people just don't understand and feel frustrated at the inhumanity that they see, and they don't know what to do. So they come to this image and pray, and they just pray that somehow all these walls that people have built can crumble, can fade away, and something beautiful can be reborn. Bethlehem is the town of birth, of rebirth, and here it's the wall just positioned on the edge of Bethlehem and the edge of Jerusalem. So it's this sort of transition point where you've got all this despair, but then also this hope breaking through.
I don't know if you can hear the bird. I don't know which bird that is. Is there anybody, an ornithologist, who could place that bird? No, I'll need to find out what it is. It'd be nice if it was a swift, but it probably wouldn't be that neat. Okay, we began the lecture at the Damascus Gate, and I'd like to finish there, or head towards a closing of there. And I'd like to introduce you to one other person called Trond Bakovic. I'm probably mispronouncing. He's Norwegian. And he's been running Krill, which is the council, or chairing it rather than running it, chairing the Council for Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. This is a council that seeks to bring together Jewish, Christian, Muslim leaders, and they've been supporting this project, which has been generously funded by the Dutch government, to try and bring together leaders with journalists as well. But it's been interesting talking with him and watching him work, because he's been working for 20 years. He's just got a book come out in Norwegian, for those of you who don't speak Norwegian, Diary from Jerusalem. I don't speak it either. But this is reflections on peace building and his work there on religion and politics for the last 20 years. Again, not doing full justice to the argument, but it's interesting, the emphasis upon religious dialogue can clear the way for political decisions. He argues passionately the importance of those involved in political dialogue of including religious leaders. One of the criticisms he articulates, and actually each of the religious leaders that we've spoken to say, is that part of the problem with the Oslo agreements was they didn't take seriously the role of religious leaders. So it's interesting hearing his reflections on the difficulties of peace building, the difficulties. He talks about bridge building. We know how difficult and long-term project it can be to build bridges, such as this one close to home. But actually, learning how to coexist is something which is, I would argue, well worth doing. Now, you may be thinking this walks sometimes are fun to do, hard to do, and can change you. And I've been reflecting actually over this last year, how has it changed myself? How has this project changed my views? I think it's changed a lot of things in a way. And I could just isolate one or two. First, I used to think interreligious dialogue was really boring. And actually, going to Jerusalem and listening to different religious leaders, I thought this really does matter. Not only does it matter, it's also dangerous. David Rosen said to me, there is no such thing as cheap interreligious dialogue here. A number of the Palestinians wouldn't be interviewed, wouldn't meet, because they thought it was actually suggesting this was a normal situation. And they didn't, and there's an argument about we need to denormalize the situation. So it's interesting, again, I found that to me was a learning experience. Other people argued, no, actually we really do need to have dialogue and conversation, because actually by improving the relationships, one journalist said, I have never heard that before, senior Israeli journalist said, I've never heard that before, it will change how I cover this story. By improving the insight and human empathy, perhaps it may lead to some structural change. Now you may think that is pie in the sky and we can talk about that, but nevertheless I suppose I do hope that there are ways, if you like, beyond the walls to build bridges. And that actually this is this extraordinary, beautiful, mesmerizing, fascinating old city has a hopeful future, and a future that is not just, if you like, curtailed by its boundaries, but rather is full of different gates that will lead into different worlds, different other people's worlds. I'm so happy that you chose this topic of boundaries, because I know we can explore it in lots of different ways, and I've been looking at the negative aspect of boundaries in many ways. But it's interesting, you could see certain boundaries are useful. Certain boundaries are to be explored in different ways, but perhaps this is just an offering and an introduction to this series, which I look forward to following either online or in person over the next weeks. But thank you very much for your attention, and I believe there's a little bit of time.
I was wondering during the lecture about the religious leaders and the actual effect they have on their congregations, because it's very easy to be, for example, the Jewish Sephardic rabbi that you mentioned is actually appointed by the government, and I'm not sure religiously how many people actually follow what he says, so I'm not sure what value it actually has for all these interfaith talks.
No, thank you. I think that's a very fair question and an important point, and I think it actually crosses over religious traditions as well. I think you can make that observation also in all three Abrahamic faiths. So I think that's a fair point. And it's interesting, I actually did ask that to one or two people of how much persuasive power, and the response I had, and do correct me if I've been misinformed, was that whilst they may not be followed closely, there is a significant respect in the different communities towards them. Respect, but it also can be deeply critical at times and distancing. So there's at times almost someone described it as like a love-hate relationship. That yes, this person is perhaps a leader or spokesperson, but he's not my spokesperson, because I may be an Ashkenazi, for example, or I completely disagree with what he's saying here. And you can see, in a way, each religious tradition is both fragmented, unstable, moving, diverse, and part of this project, it's working with religious leaders, but I don't want to overclaim that therefore it's going to change everything. I suppose all I'd say, though, is leaders are significant in some contexts. If you would, let's just take South Africa, for example, if you were to put, just as a thought experiment, remove Mandela and put, say, Slobodan Milosevic there, and saying, actually, we need to go after these people who've been oppressing us and kill them all. That's not what Mandela was arguing. So I think leaders can have a persuasive significance, but I think your point is very well made and an important one, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Noam. I'm doing the Masters in World Christianity. My question would be that you talked about the role of religious leaders in promoting interreligious dialogue. How do we balance the need for promoting peace between the need that some faith groups might feel to apologize on the behalf of people who commit heinous acts in the name of religion? Like, how do we balance the line between, like, yeah, we do want to be a religion that works with other religions and promotes peace, but also avoid the unnecessary and unfair pressure that some people might feel to apologize for acts committed in the name of religion?
That's such an interesting question. I'm hesitating to answer it because I don't know the answer exactly. I mean, and I think there may be other people in the group. I almost need time to think about that. And we're in the same school, so this could be a really so we could talk about it. I wonder if you could help me reflect on it. Maybe just give me a supplementary question. This is really unfair, just to, because I'm trying to understand precisely what's behind it. maybe we give the mic back.
Well, I guess I'm just reflecting on the fact that whenever people have committed atrocities in the name of Islam, you will always have Muslim leaders coming up and being like, oh, we're really sorry, this is not true Islam, this is not true, which obviously is like unfair because they shouldn't feel the need to do that. So how do we kind of balance, especially in a climate of like controversy, a climate of the rising of like political and conservatism and nationalism, like how do we combat this horrible tide, but at the same time, you know, still trying to promote interreligious dialogue, which is so necessary to.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, thank you. I suppose one response to that is perhaps to say, is it apology? Obviously, there are some contexts where apology is appropriate if one's involved in the act. But is there another way to say, actually, this does not an apologetic, but this does not represent Islam as the religion that I follow? For example, I'm just using that as an example. In the same way, I remember some people talking in the Northern Irish context saying, this does not represent the Christianity that I believe at the core of it is the Prince of Peace. Do you see what I mean? That would be one way of saying to turn it on its head, away from apology towards a positive statement of a religious tradition as a tradition that is actually in the business of trying to build bridges and actually break down barriers, divisive barriers. But thank you. That is it's a very thought-provoking question actually to think about, because there is pressure, a lot of pressure put on religious leaders. In a way, one of the difficulties with this project is that many of these interviews, and this is no offence to any of the interviewees, but they're senior leaders. There are some things they can't say because they are representatives. That in a way, we were actually working with, if you like, the next generation of leaders who are a bit freer. So there's less constraints on them, and can be both more angry and more open, if you like, with some things. That if you have someone who's a leader of a whole community saying something, that's potentially very explosive. Yeah, but thank you.
Hi, Jolyon, and thank you for such a provoking talk. I would like to ask if you could share what you have learned about how to overcome the challenges in creating interreligious dialogue in an environment of disenfranchisement and denormalization.
I think the first thing I want to do is respond by simply saying that, and this is not the rhetoric of humility, it's actually just the experience of that I am such a beginner at this. And in a way, I knew this would be a complicated project, but I had no idea it would be so complicated, because everything you do, from where you stay to what you eat to what you wear, has a political implication and a religious significance. So that's the first thing to say. That, the second thing is, I think the common humanity was something that learning actually being together with people can be a major way of building bridges. For example, we just had some quite difficult conversations in Ramallah, with Palestinians, and then we went for a meal, for a really nice meal in Ramallah in a hotel. We were sitting round, the most senior Muslim leader there got this big salad, and in the middle of the salad there was a great big caterpillar. And it came out, and I thought, oh no, this is a disaster. You know, I was thinking the meal would be a good way to bring us together. And actually, because he was, you know, he found that understandably, it made him feel really ill, really. It's just, oh no, that's horrible, you know. And then the waiter came and apologized, and then the manager came and apologized. And I thought, oh no, this is a disaster, you know. And then finally the kind of head of the whole hotel came, but then brought us, and we all sort of marched out the restaurant all cross, and I was thinking, oh no, this is kind of a disaster. Somebody on the way out said, well, at least it shows it's fresh, isn't it, because the caterpillar was coming. But anyway, we then walked out and had, sitting in the hotel foyer, and then the manager came and gave us all desserts, and then there was a bit of shouting, and then everyone was friends again. And it was interesting. In a way, I thought that was quite a bonding experience, that sometimes, and I use that as a very silly metaphor, that sometimes things can be very difficult in conversation, very, very difficult, and then you need to go beyond that. I could offer other stories on that, but you understand, also I need to be quite reticent, because there are some things that happen in conversation that are under Chatham House rules that are not appropriate to, I can't really talk about. But I use that as one example to say, if you like, the human sharing is significant. But I think also something I learned was sometimes not being afraid of conflict. I don't really like conflict, but actually sometimes, and some of the feedback people said, is to say you need to name it. You need to go somewhere which is difficult and dangerous, but then you need to get away from there. And have I got to, I'm going to stop there actually, because we could, yeah, okay, thank you.
Ken Webb, I have been involved in interfaith situations, lived amongst Buddhists and Muslims, and in communities where there was conflict as well, so I have some experience of this. You've talked about interfaith dialogue between leaders and the difficulties, the complexities of that. The walk through Jerusalem and the map you showed with the very clearly demarcated sectors, the boundaries between them. To what extent sort of does the man in the street, if you like, the ordinary Israeli Palestinian, is there sort of a sense in which they cross boundaries in a more fundamental, basic way? Did you come across that? And did you come across any examples of people who, at a grassroots level, are really doing pioneer work in crossing boundaries?
Yeah, and thank you. I think in a way the map is slightly problematic because it suggests there are walls within the old city. These are invisible barriers. You could say it's a tourist map. They're also, what's the word, permeable? There's a lot of, and so in a way many of the traders that I met are actually walking between these different areas happily. But in terms of groundbreaking work, yes, perhaps one of them, but I actually haven't met them I haven't met them actually yet, is mothers, and I think it is mothers actually, who have lost either from the, in the conflict, who have lost their children. And they meet together regularly because they say, both Israeli and Palestinian, saying we don't want this to go on. And they're meeting regularly. I mean, I think that was one of the stories which I found extraordinary to hear about. And often, one of the things about, I don't know if you noticed that we began with a very violent story. There's something spectacular about that. And there's even more spectacle if we cut out the spectacle. But actually, often peace building is hidden, invisible, you don't see it, it's slow, it's slightly boring, and it's hard, it's not very televisual. So in a way, a lot of the peace builders doing work you don't see, partly because they don't necessarily want to be up there in bright lights, because they think it might challenge. I mean, I spoke to some people who, let me just see if I can say this without revealing. They run, yeah, I think it's all right. They run a hospital in Gaza, and we said, oh, can we interview, because it's amazing what you're doing. And they said, no, actually, that's for someone else to talk about. We just want to get on here. We're looking after people. So it's interesting how sometimes people want to be reticent, and perhaps the more peace-building work they're doing, the quieter they are. I don't know, do you want to come back? Are there examples that you know of that you would?
I think I've heard of the same one.
Right, okay.
Somebody else, and I'm just wondering if there's any others.
Yeah, there are multiple. I mean, there are multiple, and in a way I don't want to sort of list that I'm only beginning to learn about. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. Although, when we were walking through the old town, I was wondering if we will go to the Armenian quarter. And it's very interesting for me because I know a bit of Armenian history, and I think it's very kind of special story with Armenia and religion and Armenia and war. Yeah, and I was wondering, is it the part of the story or it's the whole story, and whether Armenia and whether you involved Armenian quarter in your investigation? Thank you.
Thank you. The Armenian leadership are part of KRIL, the Council of Religious Institutions in the Holy Land, though actually not yet is the answer to that. And I think if we do a second phase, I think that's a very fair point, and I'm grateful for it. So not yet. And that's not because I don't think it's significant, it's just at this stage it hasn't happened. So thank you.
Hi. You talk a lot about well, religious leaders. That's the whole point of the thing, and interfaith dialogue, and interfaith prayer meetings and stuff between the heads of churches and faiths and stuff. But do you think that peace is actually possible through interfaith dialogue, or do you think it just exacerbates the situation in that, like, when you have the Pope and David Rosen and all the others praying together, the thing that really separates them, that causes the violence and the barriers and everything, is the difference in prayer. The very fact that they all pray differently is the cause of the violence. And when you have the Pope praying against the various walls, it's religion. He's praying for peace, but it's religion that brings the walls. Do you not think that maybe, I don't know, I don't really want to use the word, but no platforming these people could maybe just undercut the foundation of all this perennial violence, or is it sort of that they've started so they'll have to finish it?
It's George, isn't it? George, I mean, I think I would perhaps question or explore with you the premise of that question. And the premise, if I understood it rightly, is that this conflict is based upon religious beliefs, theologies. I think I'd suggest that it's far, far more complex. Religion is one element, but there are multiple other elements. Some people say one of the dangers in the conflict at the moment is it becoming religious, because they see it as actually a political conflict. So I was struck by the number of people who said, actually, this is a political conflict, which religion is being used to actually escalate it. So, for example, what's going on at the moment in Al-Hashem Reif, or the Temple Mount, as it's known, depending on what tradition you are, that actually that's become a political football. It's like the religion's become a political football. But just to push that a bit further, I do think there's very interesting work by, I think I may have a slide actually. Let's just see if it's yeah, there we are. By Scott Appleby on the ambivalence of the sacred. And in a way, part of the power of this argument, and I think it's a very significant book, he makes the argument that religion can be a driver both for violence and for peace. And he actually goes even deeper in that equation and says that if you think about it, he draws on someone called Rudolf Otto and the idea of the kind of mysterium tremendum, that religion can overwhelm us and can lead people to acts of great evil, to violence. But also, and he argues that this is often left out of the equation, it can lead people to great acts of peace building. So I wouldn't want to say you take out religion out of the equation, because if you do, then I think the reality is that many, many people are highly motivated by religious beliefs. If you just take it out, then you, if you like, you ignore a significant driver.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell.
Let's just say two short questions.
Thank you, Professor
Mitchell,
okay? For a very, very intriguing and excellent walk through the Old City. My name is Professor Joe Goldblatt, and to bring this discussion to something more local, you may know this is the 200th anniversary of the establishment of the first Jewish community in the city of Edinburgh, just 3 blocks from where we sit tonight. And to mark that occasion, a group has been working for 2 years to establish the first ever Scottish Jewish Cultural Center, an iconic building here, which we hope to establish in the next 4 or 5 years, to build bridges to other faiths and other communities. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that development in the city of Edinburgh, in a world where unfortunately anti-Semitism has increased by 40% in the last 3 years, and if you might be willing to consult with us on the development of a building that will offer arts and community as a way of bridge building. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the first I've heard of it. It sounds brilliant, and I'd be delighted to, so perhaps we could continue the conversation. And in a way, I think it's interesting reflecting on local initiatives. And go back to your question, I didn't catch your name, actually, to Ken. Ken's question as well, thinking about local communities, grassroots peace building, which I'd describe that as, is something to celebrate and support. So thank you very much for raising that as a significant example in here, rather than in somewhere else. A bit further away.
Thank you. And you have the microphone for the very last question.
Hello. So I come from India, a land of immense cultural and religious diversity, but more often than ever you don't see cultural and religious tolerance. So in a very idealistic sense, I would say, how do you think governments or different platforms or forums, what do you think, what are the policies do you think they should take up to instigate religious tolerance? Hopefully from the grassroots levels.
Thank you very much. What was her name?
Dhriti.
Dhriti, okay. I would probably invite everyone in this room here to offer one response to you, because I mean that's such a rich question. We could be here developing an entire new political party together. But it's interesting, isn't it, thinking about one of the barrier pictures that I think we didn't use, we cut out, was the barrier, of course, that was established just after the Second World War between Pakistan and India. And it's interesting thinking about, I'm just using one specific example, the role of geographers. Because, of course, there was this guy who was encouraged to just draw a line. You notice the title of this talk was Redrawing Boundaries. Some people have written about drawing boundaries in the sand, and in a way sort of a post-colonial critique was at the end of the British Empire, what we did was we started drawing lines in the sand to try and sort out some of the messes that perhaps we had created. So it's interesting thinking about what is in this country, because we're here in Edinburgh, what's our responsibility to those boundaries that we, if you like, contributed towards? So one way perhaps is to think about, is there a responsibility that we have, not in a paternalistic or colonial way, but towards other nations that we are sharing either identities or histories with, such as Israel-Palestine. There is a link, there is a significant link in the same way there is a significant link with India and Pakistan, and therefore each of us here, there is a responsibility perhaps to actually say that our responsibility is beyond just the single nation state. And actually it's to a fragile blue planet where actually many boundaries are threatening not just us as a species, but many other species. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you to the audience for all of your questions, and I'm sure you'll join with me in giving a huge round of thanks to our speakers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.